The Colorado sun hung merciless and white overhead when Thorn Jameson first spotted the woman collapsed beside a rusted plow, her dress soaked through with sweat and her hands bleeding onto the unforgiving earth of the Texas frontier. He had been tracking elk through the mountains west of San Elizario when he decided to descend into the valley, his pack horse laden with furs and dried meat from 3 months of solitary living in the high country. The year was 1878. And spring had come late to this stretch of territory, leaving the ground baked hard as iron from the previous summer's drought. Thorn stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, muscles hewn from years of wrestling timber and hauling trap lines through snow that would have killed lesser men. His dark hair fell past his collar, streaked with hints of copper from constant exposure to the elements, and his hands were calloused thick as leather. The woman looked to be maybe 20 years old, slight of build but with a stubborn set to her jaw even in exhaustion. Her auburn hair had escaped its pins and stuck to her neck and forehead. Beside her lay a mule that looked nearly as worn as she did, its ribs showing through dull hide. Thorn dismounted and approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When his shadow fell across her face, her eyes flew open, a striking shade of green that reminded him of new aspen leaves in June. "Easy there," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not here to harm you." She scrambled backward, her hand reaching for something that was not there. A weapon, likely. He raised both hands to show they were empty. "My name is Thorn Jameson. You look like you could use some help." "I can manage," she said, but her voice cracked with thirst, and her lips were split from the sun. He pulled his canteen from his belt and held it out. She stared at it for a long moment before her need overcame her caution. She drank deeply, water spilling down her chin. "Thank you," she managed. "I am Bethany Turner. What are you doing out here alone trying to work this ground? It has not seen rain in months. You would have better luck plowing stone." Her face flushed, though whether from heat or embarrassment he could not tell. "My father claimed this quarter section last year. He died 2 months back from fever. I have to get crops in or I will lose the claim. The land office says I have until the end of June to show improvement." Thorn looked at the pathetic furrow she had managed to scratch into the earth, maybe 20 feet long and barely 3 inches deep. The wooden plow was so old it looked ready to splinter apart, and her mule was half-starved. "You have been at this long?" "Since dawn." He glanced at the sun. Past noon already. She had been working in killing heat for 6 hours and had almost nothing to show for it. "Get yourself into that shade over there," he said, pointing to a cluster of cottonwoods about 50 yards distant. "I will work this ground for you." "I cannot ask you to do that." "You did not ask. I offered. Now go rest before you fall over dead." She opened her mouth to protest, but he was already unhitching her mule from the plow. He examined the harness and found it cracked in 3 places, held together with wire and prayer. "You got water for this animal?" "There's a stream by the trees." "Go on then. Take him with you and let him drink his fill." Bethany struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. Thorn steadied her with one hand, and even through his rough palm he could feel the fever heat of her sunburned skin. "You need to get cool or you will be sick," he said more gently. "Please, let me do this." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she took the mule's lead rope and began walking toward the cottonwoods, her gait unsteady. Thorn watched until he was certain she would make it, then turned his attention to the plow. The blade was dull as a butter knife and the handles were loose. He spent 15 minutes making what repairs he could with materials from his pack, then inspected the ground. The topsoil had been good once, but without moisture, it had baked into something like poorly fired pottery. He would need to break it deep to have any hope of reaching soil that might still hold some life. Thorn unhitched his own horse, a sturdy mountain-bred gelding named Bear, and hitched him to the plow instead. Bear was twice the size of that poor mule, and bred for hauling heavy loads through mountain passes. If anything could break this ground, he could. "Come on, boy," Thorn said, taking up the handles. "Let us show this stubborn earth who is boss." He put his weight behind the plow and called to Bear. The horse leaned into the harness and the blade bit into the ground with a sound like tearing canvas. Thorn gritted his teeth and pushed, muscles bunching across his shoulders and back. The earth resisted, then gave way inch by grudging inch. It was brutal work. Sweat soaked through his buckskin shirt within minutes, and his shoulders screamed with the effort of keeping the blade level and deep. But Thorn had spent his life doing brutal work. He had hauled beaver traps through chest-deep snow, had wrestled grizzly bears off his kill, had built entire cabins with nothing but an axe and his own 2 hands. This was just one more fight against an uncaring world, and he would be damned if he let it win. From beneath the cottonwoods, Bethany watched in amazement. She had draped herself with a wet cloth from the stream and given her mule water and a handful of grain from her nearly empty sack. Now she sat in the dappled shade and watched this mountain man tear furrows into earth that had defeated her completely. He moved like some force of nature himself, all coiled power and grim determination. His shoulders strained against his shirt with every step, and she could see the play of muscle in his forearms where he had rolled back his sleeves. There was something almost beautiful about the way he moved, despite the ugliness of the labor, like watching a blacksmith at his forge or a sculptor attacking marble. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains. Thorn never stopped, never slowed. He completed 1 furrow, turned bare around, and started another. The field began to take shape, raw earth exposed to the air for the first time in months. Bethany found herself dozing in the heat, the sound of the plow a rhythmic scraping that was oddly soothing. She woke once to find the sun considerably lower, and Thorn still working, his shirt now dark with sweat. She woke again to the sound of him leading Bear to the stream. "How long was I asleep?" she called out, her voice still rough. "Few hours," he said, letting Bear drink. "You needed it." She stood and walked to the edge of the field, hardly believing what she saw. He had plowed nearly half an acre, 10 times what she had managed in days of trying. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. He shrugged, pulling off his hat to wipe sweat from his forehead. His hair was plastered to his head, and his face was streaked with dust, but his dark eyes were kind when they met hers. "No thanks needed, but you are going to need seed, and you are going to need it soon. Ground like this will dry out again quick once it is turned. I have seed. My father bought it before he died. Corn and beans both. Good. You will want to get it in tomorrow if you can. And you need to rig some kind of irrigation from that stream, or everything will shrivel before it gets 6 inches high." "I know. I just could not get the ground broken. I tried for a week." Thorn looked at the rusted plow and the half-dead mule. "Your equipment is no good and your animal is near done. You got anyone in town who could help you?" Her face closed off. "No." There was a story there, but he did not push. Instead, he said, "I will come back tomorrow and help you plant. Day after that, we will work on irrigation." "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." He considered the question, looking out at the raw furrows striping the field. "My mother homesteaded in Colorado back in '59. My father died on the journey west, and she raised me and my sisters alone on a claim not much bigger than this one. I remember what it was like, watching her work herself to bone trying to prove up that land. Nobody helped us. Folks in town thought a woman alone had no business trying to farm. They waited for her to fail." "Did she?" "No. She was the stubbornest woman God ever made, and she willed that land into producing out of sheer spite. But it near killed her, and it did not have to be that way. If just one person had helped, it would have been different." He looked back at Bethany. "So that is why. Because someone should have helped my mother, and I can help you." Bethany felt something catch in her chest. In the 2 months since her father had died, she had been turned away from every door in San Elizario. The townspeople were not cruel exactly, but they were practical. A young woman alone could not work a farm. She should sell the claim, they said, find herself a husband, go back east to family. But she had no family back east, and her father had spent his last dollars and his last strength on this quarter section. She would not let it go without a fight. "I have a little money," she said. "Not much, but I could pay you something." Thorn shook his head. "Keep your money. You will need it for supplies." "Then what do you want?" "A hot meal would not go amiss. I've been eating my own cooking for 3 months and it gets tiresome." Despite everything, Bethany smiled. "I can manage that. My cabin is just over that rise. It is not much, but the stove works." "Then we have a deal." They walked together toward the rise, Bear plodding behind and her mule trailing along unbidden. The cabin came into view as they crested the hill, a single-room structure of rough-hewn logs with a sod roof. Thorn had seen worse, but not by much. The chinking between the logs needed work, and the door hung crooked on leather hinges. "My father built it last summer," Bethany said, a note of defensiveness in her voice. "He was a clerk, not a carpenter. He did his best." "It is solid enough," Thorn said diplomatically. "Roof looks sound." She smiled gratefully and pushed open the door. Inside was dim and spare. A cast-iron stove in one corner, a narrow bed in another, a rough table and 2 chairs. Shelves held a meager collection of foodstuffs and a few battered cooking implements. But it was clean, everything in its place, and there were wildflowers in a jar on the table. "Make yourself comfortable," Bethany said. "I will get started on supper." Thorn sat at the table, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. His shoulders ached and his hands were cramping from gripping the plow handles, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from useful work. He watched Bethany move around the small space, building up the fire in the stove and pulling out supplies. She moved with efficient grace despite her earlier exhaustion, and he found himself noticing details he had been too focused to see before. The way the lamplight caught in her hair, turning it the color of burnished copper. The determined set of her chin, the capable movements of her hands as she worked. "How old are you, if you do not mind my asking?" he said. 20, 21 in August. "You?" 24 come fall." She nodded, measuring cornmeal into a bowl. "You said you have been in the mountains for 3 months?" "About that. I trap in winter and early spring, then bring the furs down to sell when the snow clears. Usually I head back up before summer, but I decided to take some time in the lowlands this year, getting tired of talking to myself, I suppose." "What made you become a mountain man?" He was quiet for a moment, memories flickering behind his eyes. "After my mother died, there was nothing holding me in Colorado. My sisters had married and moved on. The farm sold to pay debts. I was 18 and angry at the world. Went into the mountains to get away from people and found I preferred it there. Animals do not lie to you. The weather does not pretend to be something it is not. There is an honesty to mountain living that I appreciate. It sounds lonely. Sometimes. But loneliness in the mountains is cleaner somehow, not like the loneliness of being surrounded by people who do not care whether you live or die." Bethany turned from the stove, something sharp and understanding in her eyes. "Yes, I know exactly what you mean." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, a recognition passing between them. Two people who had learned the hard way that survival often meant standing alone. "Tell me about San Elizario," Thorn said, breaking the moment. "What kind of town is it?" Bethany turned back to her cooking, but her shoulders had tensed. "Small, maybe 300 people, half of them Mexican families who have been here since Texas was still part of Mexico. The other half are Anglo settlers, ranchers and farmers mostly. There's a general store, a saloon, a church. The Army has a small garrison a few miles south at Fort Bliss." "And they were no help when your father died." Her jaw tightened. "The townspeople made it clear that a young woman alone is considered available property. I had 3 separate men propose marriage within a week of my father's death. Not because they cared for me, but because they wanted the land claim. When I refused them all, they got angry, said I was being foolish, said I would fail, and then I would come crawling back begging for help." "Sounds like they wanted you to fail." "One of them did more than want it. Marcus Whelan owns the big cattle ranch east of here. He's been trying to buy up all the homestead claims in this area to expand his range. My father refused to sell, and now Whelan is waiting for me to give up so he can buy the land from the government for pennies." Thorn's expression darkened. "Has he threatened you?" "Not directly, but his men ride past here regularly. They never say anything, just look at me in a way that makes it clear I am not wanted here. Last week someone cut my irrigation ditch I had started to dig. Could have been animals, but I doubt it. And the law. The nearest marshal is in El Paso, 15 miles north. He's made it clear that disputes between ranchers and homesteaders are not his concern unless someone gets killed." Thorn absorbed this information grimly. He had seen this pattern before throughout the West. Big ranchers pushing out small farmers, using intimidation and violence to claim land they had no legal right to. His mother had faced the same threats in Colorado. "Well," he said slowly, "I will be around for a while yet. If Whelan or his men give you trouble, they will have to go through me." Bethany turned, surprise clear on her face. "You would do that? You do not even know me." "I know enough, and I do not like bullies." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was real or some fever dream brought on by heat stroke. Finally she said, "You are not like other men I have met. I will take that as a compliment. It was meant as one." They ate supper as the sun set, simple fare of cornbread and beans with a little bacon fat for flavor. To Thorn, it tasted better than anything he had eaten in months, and he said so. "That is just because you are hungry," Bethany said, but she looked pleased. "No, it is because it was cooked with care. There is a difference." After supper, Thorn insisted on helping clean up, which seemed to surprise her. When everything was put away, he stood awkwardly in the small space, suddenly uncertain. "I should make camp before it gets full dark," he said. "I will be back at first light tomorrow to help with planting." "You could stay here," Bethany said, then immediately flushed. "I mean, there is no reason to camp out when there is shelter available. You could take the floor. I have extra blankets." Thorn considered. It would be more comfortable than sleeping on the ground, and he could keep watch in case Whelan's men decided to cause trouble in the night. But he did not want to compromise her reputation any more than his presence already would. "Folks might talk if they knew I stayed here," he said carefully. "Folks already talk, and I would feel safer knowing someone else was nearby." That decided him. "All right, thank you." They arranged his bedroll on the floor near the door, and Bethany banked the fire in the stove. The small cabin grew dark except for moonlight filtering through the single window. "Thorn," Bethany said from the bed, her voice soft in the darkness. "Yes?" "Thank you for everything today. I do not know what I would have done if you had not come along." "You would have figured something out. You strike me as the stubborn type." He heard her soft laugh. "My father always said I was too stubborn for my own good." Stubbornness is not always a bad trait, especially out here. They fell silent, listening to the night sounds of the desert, coyotes yipping in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Thorn lay awake for a long time, staring at the rough beams of the ceiling. He told himself he was just being cautious, listening for trouble. But part of him knew it was more than that. Something had shifted today when he had seen Bethany collapsed beside that plow. Some wall he had built around himself after his mother's death had developed a crack. He was not sure yet whether that was a good thing or a dangerous one. Morning came early, light bleeding through the window to wake them both. Bethany rose first and rekindled the fire to make coffee and fry some cornmeal mush. They ate quickly, both eager to get to work while the morning was still cool. The field looked different in the dawn light, the turned earth dark and rich compared to the sun-bleached surroundings. Thorn hitched Bear to a drag made from a cottonwood log to break up the clods, while Bethany brought out the precious seed corn and beans her father had purchased. They worked side by side through the morning, Thorn cutting furrows with a hoe, while Bethany followed behind, dropping seeds and covering them. It was meditative work, and they fell into an easy rhythm. Occasionally they talked, sharing small pieces of their histories. Bethany had been born in Pennsylvania, the only child of a bookkeeper and a schoolteacher. Her mother had died when she was 12, and she had kept house for her father after that. When his health began to fail from long hours in poorly ventilated offices, a doctor had recommended the dry climate of the Southwest. They had headed to Texas with dreams of a fresh start. He was happy here, Bethany said, pressing seeds into the earth. Even though the work was hard and he was not built for it, he loved the wide sky and the silence. He said it felt like freedom. "It does," Thorn agreed. "That is why I stay in the mountains. Up there, you can see forever. Makes the world feel bigger somehow." "Do you ever get scared? Being alone in wild country?" "Sometimes. But being scared keeps you sharp. The day you stop being scared is the day you get careless, and careless gets you killed." By noon, they had planted 3/4 of the field. Thorn called a halt and made Bethany rest in the shade while he went to examine the stream. It was shallow but steady, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. With some work, it could be diverted to water the crops. He spent the afternoon digging an irrigation ditch while Bethany finished planting the last section. It was backbreaking work, moving earth with a shovel under the climbing sun, but Thorn kept at it with single-minded determination. By evening, he had cut a channel from the stream to the field and used rocks and clay to build a simple gate to control the water flow. When he opened the gate, water flowed down the ditch and began spreading through the furrows. Bethany stood beside him, watching with shining eyes as the first precious moisture soaked into the planted rows. It is working," she breathed. "It is really working." "It is a start," Thorn said. "You will need to tend it careful-like. Make sure the water spreads even and does not wash out the seeds. In a few days you might see the first sprouts. I cannot believe we did this in 2 days. I'd been trying for weeks. You did not have the right tools or the right help, that is all." She turned to him, her green eyes serious. "It was not just tools. You did this. You saved my claim, Thorn. You saved everything my father worked for." He shifted uncomfortably, not used to such direct gratitude. "I just did what needed doing. Most men would have ridden past, or worse, they would have helped with expectations attached. I am not most men." "No," she said softly. "You certainly are not." Something passed between them in that moment, an awareness that made Thorn's breath catch. Bethany stood close enough that he could smell the clean scent of her hair and see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. For a wild moment, he wanted to reach out, to touch the curve of her cheek, to see if her skin was as soft as it looked. Instead, he stepped back, putting safe distance between them. "We should eat," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Then I need to head into town tomorrow to sell my furs. You should come with me. Stock up on supplies while you have the chance." If Bethany noticed his retreat, she did not comment on it. "All right, I need flour and salt anyway, and I should check if there is mail." They ate supper together again, the small cabin filling with the comfortable sounds of shared space. Thorn found himself relaxing in a way he had not in years, the constant vigilance of mountain living easing. It was dangerous, this comfort. It made a man soft, but he could not quite bring himself to care. That night, as he lay on his bedroll listening to Bethany's quiet breathing from the bed, Thorn admitted to himself that he was in trouble. He had planned to spend a week or 2 in the lowlands, sell his furs, and head back to the mountains. But now the thought of leaving made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. He barely knew this woman. 2 days was nothing, a blink in a life spent mostly in solitude. But there was something about her, some combination of strength and vulnerability that called to something deep in him. She reminded him of his mother, not in appearance, but in that core of stubborn determination, the refusal to bend even when the whole world was trying to break her. Men like him did not get happy endings. Mountain men died alone, frozen in blizzards or mauled by bears or simply worn down by hard living until their bodies gave out. That was the price of choosing solitude over society. But maybe, a small voice whispered in his mind, maybe it did not have to be that way. He fell asleep to that thought and dreamed of green eyes and copper hair. San Elizario baked under the morning sun as they rode in on the wagon Thorn had rigged from salvaged lumber. His pack-horse was tied behind, laden with furs that would fetch good money from traders heading south to Mexico. Bethany sat beside him on the wagon seat, wearing her best dress and a bonnet to protect her face from the sun. The town sprawled along the road, a collection of adobe buildings interspersed with wooden structures that looked perpetually on the verge of collapse. Mexican families sat in the shade of their homes, watching the wagon pass with polite disinterest. Anglo settlers moved between the store and saloon, conducting the business of frontier commerce. Thorn felt eyes on them as they rolled down the main street, curiosity and calculation mixed together. A young woman with a strange man was news in a town this small, and he could practically see the gossip starting to form. "Where's the trading post?" he asked Bethany. "End of the street across from the church. Old man named Santos runs it. He is fair in his dealings, at least." Thorn pulled the wagon up in front of a long adobe building with Santos Trading painted in fading letters above the door. A bell chimed as they entered, and a wizened Mexican man looked up from behind a counter piled with goods. "Miss Turner," he said, surprise evident in his voice, "I did not expect to see you in town. And who is this?" "Thorn Jameson, sir," Thorn said, extending his hand. "I am a trapper up from the mountains. I have furs to trade if you are buying." Santos shook his hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "Always buying quality furs. Let me see what you have." They spent the next hour negotiating. Santos was indeed fair, and Thorn got good prices for his beaver and fox pelts. The money would keep him comfortable for months if he was careful with it. While Thorn conducted his business, Bethany moved through the store selecting supplies: flour, salt, sugar, coffee beans, a side of bacon. Santos watched her tally grow with approval. "You are stocking up well, Miss Turner. Does this mean you are planning to stay on your claim?" "I am, Mr. Santos. The crops are in the ground and looking promising." "I am glad to hear it. Your father was a good man. He would be proud of you." "Thank you. That means a great deal." As Bethany paid for her supplies, the door opened and 3 men walked in. Thorn felt her stiffen beside him and looked up to see what had caused the reaction. The man in front was tall and well-dressed in the manner of a wealthy rancher, with a silver-belly Stetson and polished boots. His face was handsome in a cold way, with pale blue eyes that assessed everything with the calculation of a man used to getting what he wanted. Behind him stood 2 harder men, ranch hands by their looks, both wearing guns in well-used holsters. "Well, well," the first man said, his voice smooth as oil. "Bethany Turner. I heard you were still clinging to that worthless patch of dirt. I assumed by now you would have seen sense and moved on." "Hello, Marcus," Bethany said, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm not moving on. The claim is being worked as required by law." Marcus Whelan's eyes slid to Thorn, taking in his size and the mountain man's rough clothing. "And who is this? Another suitor come to rescue the poor, helpless widow?" "Orphan," Bethany corrected, "and I do not need rescuing. This is Thorn Jameson. He is helping me with the farm work." "Is he now?" Whelan's expression hardened. "You know, Miss Turner, I have been patient with you. I have made you generous offers for that land, but my patience is not unlimited. One woman cannot work a quarter section alone. Eventually you will fail, and I would hate to see you lose everything when you could sell now for fair price. Your offers have been well below fair value." Bethany said, steel in her voice, "And I am not alone. I have help." Whelan's gaze returned to Thorn, hostile now. "You're making a mistake getting involved here, friend. This does not concern you." Thorn straightened to his full height, which put him eye to eye with Whelan and several inches taller than the ranch hands. "The lady seems to think it does concern me. I tend to respect a lady's judgment." "Do you now? Well, let me give you some advice, mountain man. This territory is not friendly to outsiders who stick their noses where they do not belong. Accidents happen, people disappear. You would be wise to pack up and head back to whatever hole you crawled out of." The threat was barely veiled, and Thorn felt his temper stir. But losing his temper would only make things worse for Bethany after he left, so he kept his voice calm and level when he replied. "I appreciate the concern, but I will be sticking around for a while yet. Hard to say how long. Could be weeks, could be months. I tend to stay as long as I'm needed." The 2 men stared at each other, tension crackling between them like heat lightning. Finally Whelan smiled, cold and mean. "Your funeral," he said. Then to Bethany, "My offer stands, Miss Turner. When you come to your senses, you know where to find me." He turned and walked out, his men following. The bell chimed behind them with false cheerfulness. Santos let out a long breath. "You have made an enemy there, Mr. Jameson. Would not be the first. Probably will not be the last. Marcus Whelan is not a man to cross lightly. He has money and influence. The law looks the other way when his men get rough. Then the law is broken. But that does not change what is right." Santos studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Your supplies are on the house, Miss Turner. Consider it thanks for bringing some backbone to this town. God knows we could use more of it." "Mr. Santos, I could not possibly." "I insist. Your father was my friend. Let me help his daughter how I can." Bethany's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Thank you, truly." They loaded the supplies into the wagon and headed back toward the farm. Bethany was quiet, her hands twisting in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I should have warned you about Whelan before we came to town. Now you are caught up in this mess." "I would have gotten caught up anyway. Men like that do not leave well enough alone." He meant what he said about accidents. 2 homesteaders have died in the last year under suspicious circumstances. One supposedly fell in a well. The other was trampled by his own horse. Both of their claims were bought by Whelan afterward. Thorn's jaw tightened. "Did anyone investigate?" The marshal came out from El Paso, but there was no evidence of foul play, or at least nothing he would act on. Everyone knew what really happened, but knowing and proving are different things. Well, Whelan is going to find me harder to kill than some dirt farmer, and I will be watching close from now on. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon rattling over the rough road. Finally, Bethany said, "Why are you doing this, Thorn? Really? It cannot just be about your mother." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "When I was 19, I watched a man beat his wife outside a trading post in Colorado. He was drunk and mean, and she had apparently embarrassed him somehow. I started to intervene, but the other men there stopped me. Said it was none of my business, said a man had a right to discipline his wife however he saw fit, so I did nothing. I walked away." He paused, his hands tight on the reins. "That woman died 2 weeks later. Her husband claimed she fell down the stairs, but everyone knew the truth. And I knew that if I had done something that day, if I had stood up to him and damned the consequences, she might still be alive. That was not your fault. Maybe not. But I swore after that I would never walk away again when someone needed help. I have broken a lot of promises in my life, but not that one. So that is why I am doing this, because I can, and because it is right, and because I could not live with myself if I walked away." Bethany reached over and placed her hand on his forearm, a gentle touch that somehow carried enormous weight. "You are a good man, Thorn Jameson. I am just a man, but I'm trying to be a good one." They returned to the farm to find the irrigation ditch had been filled in with rocks and the water flow blocked. It was crude sabotage, easy enough to fix but sending a clear message. Thorn stood looking at the damage, his expression grim. Whelan did not waste any time. "This is my fault," Bethany said, voice tight with anger and fear. "I should have just sold when he first offered. Now you are in danger because of me. This was always going to happen. At least now you are not facing it alone." He jumped down from the wagon and started clearing rocks from the ditch. "Get your rifle and keep watch. If his men are bold enough to come onto your land in daylight, they might come back." Bethany retrieved her father's old Springfield rifle from the cabin and took up position where she could see the approaches. Thorn worked quickly, clearing the blockage and getting water flowing again. The crops were still too new to have suffered from a few hours without water, but the message was clear. Whelan could hurt her any time he wanted. When the ditch was clear, Thorn spent the rest of the afternoon fortifying the farm. He repaired the cabin door and added a proper bar on the inside. He built a small shelter for the animals closer to the house where they could be watched. He cut firing ports in the cabin walls, narrow slits that would allow them to shoot out while remaining protected. Bethany watched these preparations with growing unease. "You really think it will come to shooting?" "I hope not, but hoping is not a plan. If Whelan wants you gone bad enough, he will escalate. Better to be ready." That night they ate a cold supper, not wanting to light the stove and announce their presence. Thorn kept his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the dark beyond the windows. "Tell me about the mountains," Bethany said softly. "I want to think about something beautiful." So Thorn talked, describing the high country in words that were almost poetic for a man so rough-spoken. He told her about mornings when the valleys filled with clouds and the peaks rose above like islands in a white sea. About crystal lakes so clear you could see trout swimming 20 feet down. About the silence of snow falling in deep forest, muffling the world until it felt like being wrapped in wool. "It sounds like heaven," Bethany said. "It is, but it is a lonely heaven. I've been thinking lately that maybe some things are worth trading solitude for." In the darkness, she could not see his face clearly, but something in his voice made her heart beat faster. "What kind of things?" "Company, conversation, someone to share the sunset with." He paused. "Someone to build a life with, maybe." The silence stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Finally, Bethany said, "I would like to see your mountains someday. I would like to show them to you." Nothing more was said, but something had shifted between them, an understanding forming in the spaces between words. The night passed quietly, no sign of Whelan or his men. As dawn broke, Thorn finally allowed himself to relax slightly. Perhaps the confrontation in town had been enough. Perhaps Whelan would back off now that he knew Bethany had protection. It was a vain hope, and he knew it, but sometimes a man needed to hope anyway. The days fell into a pattern. Thorn rose at dawn and checked the perimeter, looking for signs of tampering or surveillance. Then they would tend the crops together, watching anxiously for the first signs of growth. In the afternoons, he worked on improving the farm, making repairs and additions that should have been done when the cabin was first built. Evenings they spent talking, sharing meals and stories as the desert cooled around them. On the 5th day, the first shoots appeared, tiny green spears pushing through the dark earth. Bethany nearly wept with relief when she saw them. Thorn stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder, and felt his own throat grow tight. "Your father would be proud," he said. "I wish he could see this. He wanted so badly for this place to thrive." "He can see it, and he knows you did not give up." She leaned against him then, just for a moment, letting herself be comforted. Thorn wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and they stood together watching the tiny shoots wave in the breeze. It was the first time they had touched beyond brief practical contact, and Thorn was hyper-aware of the warmth of her body against his side, the way her head fit just under his chin. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. You do not need to keep thanking me." "Yes, I do, because not enough people in this world deserve thanks, and the ones who do should hear it." He had no answer to that, so he just held her and watched the crops grow. That night as they prepared for bed, Bethany said, "Thorn, I have been thinking. You have been sleeping on that hard floor for nearly a week now. It cannot be comfortable. I have slept on worse. That's not the point. The bed is big enough for two if we are sensible about it. You take one side and I will take the other. We are both adults. We can manage propriety." Every instinct told him this was a bad idea. Sleeping in the same bed would blur lines that should stay clear. But he was tired, and his back did ache from the floor, and the thought of being close to her was more tempting than he wanted to admit. "If you are sure," he said finally. "I am sure." They lay down on opposite sides of the narrow bed, backs to each other, a careful foot of space between them. Thorn was intensely aware of every breath she took, every small movement. The bed smelled like her, something clean and faintly floral that made his head spin. "Thorn," she said into the darkness. "Yes?" "If I asked you to stay after the crops are established, would you?" His heart hammered against his ribs. "Are you asking?" "Not yet, but I might be. Eventually. Then I should tell you that I have been thinking about staying, even before you asked. I have been thinking about a lot of things." "What kind of things?" "Things I probably should not be thinking about." He heard her shift, felt the mattress dip as she turned to face his back. "Maybe you should be thinking about them. Maybe we both should." Thorn rolled over to face her, and in the moonlight he could see her expression, open and vulnerable and hopeful all at once. They were close enough that he could feel her breath on his face. "Bethany," he said, his voice rough, "I am not an easy man. I have lived rough and hard, and I do not know how to be gentle with things. I do not know if I would be any good at being what you need. What I need is someone who sees me as strong enough to stand beside, not fragile enough to be sheltered. What I need is someone who does not expect me to be anything other than what I am. Do you think you could do that?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I know you are strong. I have seen it." "Then maybe we could see where this goes. No promises, no expectations, just two people who are tired of being alone." Thorn reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, he cupped her cheek in his calloused hand. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing. "I am afraid," he admitted, "of caring too much, of losing what I care about. I am afraid too, but I'm more afraid of letting fear keep me from living." He leaned forward and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper when she responded. Her hand came up to tangle in his hair, and they clung to each other in the darkness, two lonely souls finding unexpected comfort. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Thorn rested his forehead against hers. "I am staying," he said, "for as long as you will have me. That might be a very long time." "Good." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for the first time in years, neither of them was lonely. The next weeks passed in a haze of hard work and growing affection. The crops grew steadily, encouraged by regular water and Bethany's careful tending. Thorn built a proper barn for the animals and expanded the cabin with an additional room that could serve as a pantry or eventually a nursery if things progressed the way he hoped they might. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small intimacies of shared life. Thorn discovered that Bethany sang while she worked, old hymns and folk songs in a clear soprano that made his chest ache. Bethany learned that Thorn was surprisingly well-read, carrying a battered copy of Emerson in his pack that he would read aloud to her in the evenings. They grew comfortable with casual touches, his hand on her back as he passed by, her fingers brushing his as she handed him a cup of coffee. And at night they slept tangled together, talking in whispers until sleep claimed them. But their peaceful existence was not to last. It was mid-June when the trouble came. Thorn was in the field checking on the corn, which had grown nearly 2 feet tall, when he heard riders approaching. He straightened, hand moving instinctively to the rifle he now carried everywhere. 5 men rode up to the cabin, Whelan in the lead. Thorn walked back quickly, arriving as Bethany emerged with her own rifle. "Morning, Miss Turner," Whelan said, his voice falsely pleasant. "I see your crops are coming along nicely. Remarkable, really, considering your inexperience. What do you want, Marcus?" "I wanted to make you one final offer. $500 for your claim to be finalized today. It is more than generous for unproven land." "The answer is no. It has always been no." Whelan's expression hardened. "You are trying my patience, girl. I have been polite, but my patience has limits. Then it is fortunate I do not require your patience. This is my land, legally claimed and properly worked. You have no right to it. Rights are what powerful men say they are, and I am very powerful in this territory." He looked at Thorn. "Still here, Mountain Man? I thought you would have gotten the message by now." "I'm slow that way. Takes a lot to run me off." "Then let me be clearer." Whelan nodded to his men. 2 of them dismounted and walked toward the irrigation ditch. Before Thorn could react, they pulled out sledgehammers and began smashing the gate he had built to control the water flow. "Stop that!" Bethany shouted, raising her rifle. "I would not, Miss Turner," Whelan said, his hand resting on his own revolver. "Threatening a man with a weapon is a serious crime. Self-defense, however, is perfectly legal. My men would be well within their rights to defend themselves if you pointed that rifle at them." Thorn stepped in front of Bethany, his own rifle held across his chest, in a ready but not overtly threatening position. "Call off your men, Whelan." "Or what? You will shoot us? There are 5 of us and 2 of you, and unlike that farmer girl, I am actually willing to pull the trigger." The men finished destroying the gate and moved toward the ditch itself, starting to fill it with rocks and debris, months of work being undone in minutes. Thorn felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "You can break things all you want. We will rebuild. You cannot be here every day." "No, but I can make sure your crops do not survive. Without water in this heat, they will be dead in 3 days, and I can do this again and again until you give up or run out of money for supplies." "Why?" Bethany demanded, her voice breaking. "Why do you want this land so badly? There are thousands of acres of unclaimed territory out there." "Because this land borders my property on 2 sides. Because allowing squatters to succeed encourages more squatters. And because I always get what I want, one way or another." He tipped his hat mockingly. "You have until the end of the month to accept my offer. After that, I stop being polite." He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following after completing their destruction. Thorn and Bethany stood watching them go, helpless fury radiating from them both. "I am going to kill him," Bethany said flatly. "No, you are not. That would make you the criminal and him the victim. We are going to be smarter than that." "How? You saw what he did. He can destroy everything we have built and face no consequences." Thorn was quiet for a moment, thinking hard. Then he said, "I need to go to El Paso, talk to the marshal, file a formal complaint, get this on the record even if nothing comes of it, and I need to send a telegram to Denver." "Why Denver?" "I have a friend there, man I trapped with years back. He went into law, works for the territorial government now. If we cannot get justice locally, maybe we can get attention from higher up. That could take weeks. The crops will be dead by then. Not if we fix the ditch and post guard. One of us watches at all times, rifle at hand. He tries this again. We defend our property. That is legal even if threatening him is not." Bethany looked at the ruined gate, tears of frustration in her eyes. "I am so tired of fighting." Thorn pulled her into his arms, his embrace strong and steadying. "I know, but you are not fighting alone anymore. We are in this together." She clung to him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Together," she repeated. They spent the rest of the day repairing the damage. This time, Thorn built the gate stronger, reinforcing it with iron straps he had purchased in town. He also constructed a small shelter near the ditch where one of them could sit with a clear view of the approaches. The next morning, Thorn rode to El Paso, leaving Bethany armed and with strict instructions not to hesitate if Whelan's men returned. The town was larger than San Elizario, a bustling frontier settlement that served as the gateway to Mexico. He found the marshal's office easily enough, a squat adobe building near the center of town. Marshal Tom Hawkins was a weathered man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much violence. He listened to Thorn's story with the air of a man hearing something familiar and unwelcome. "Whelan again," he said when Thorn finished. "That man is going to hang himself eventually, but he has not quite crossed the line yet. He is destroying property and making threats. How is that not crossing the line? Destroying the gate is vandalism, hard to prove without witnesses who will testify. The threats were vague enough that a good lawyer could argue he was just negotiating. And Whelan has a very good lawyer." "So you will do nothing?" "I did not say that. I will ride out and talk to him, make it clear that I am watching. File your complaint formally and I will keep it on record. If he escalates to violence or more provable crimes, we will have documentation to support charges." It was less than Thorn had hoped for, but more than he had expected. He filed the formal complaint, giving detailed descriptions of everything Whelan had done. Then he went to the telegraph office and sent a message to Denver, explaining the situation to his old friend and asking for any assistance the territorial government might provide. He returned to the farm as evening fell, relieved to find everything intact and Bethany safe. She had spent the day on watch and was exhausted, her eyes red from staring into the sun for hours. "Anything?" she asked. "A complaint on file and a promise to investigate. Not much, but it is something. And I sent word to Denver. We might get help from the territorial government. In time? I do not know, but we keep fighting until we know for certain we cannot win." That night they held each other close, drawing comfort from physical proximity. Thorn ran his fingers through Bethany's hair, and she traced the scars on his arms, each one a story of survival. "Tell me we are going to be all right," she whispered. "We are going to be all right. I swear it." He hoped he was not lying to her. The next days were tense, both of them waiting for Whelan's next move. But the ranch owner seemed to be biding his time, content to let fear do his work for him. The crops continued to grow, the corn now waist-high and the beans climbing their poles. By Thorn's estimation, they would have harvestable crops by early August if nothing went wrong. It was July 4th when the circuit preacher came through San Elizario, holding services in the small church and offering to perform marriages for any couples who wanted them. Thorn and Bethany rode into town for the service, needing the brief respite and the reminder that community existed beyond conflict. After the service, as people gathered for a communal meal, old Mr. Santos pulled them aside. "I have news," he said quietly. "Whelan has been buying up debts around town. Anyone who owes money, he's purchasing their notes and calling them due immediately. He's putting pressure on anyone who might support you." "Can he do that?" Bethany asked. "If the debts are legitimate and properly documented, yes. He is within his legal rights, even if the timing is suspicious." Thorn felt cold anger settle in his gut. Whelan was not just attacking them directly, he was isolating them, making sure no one else would help for fear of economic ruin. "Has he approached you?" Thorn asked. Santos smiled grimly. "He tried. I own my property outright and owe no man a cent. One of the advantages of being old and careful with money. But others are not so fortunate." They returned to the farm in somber mood, the brief moment of normalcy shattered. As they unhitched the wagon, Bethany said, "We cannot win this, can we? Even if we save the crops, he will find another way to hurt us. He can keep this up forever, and we cannot." "Then we change the game," Thorn said. "How?" An idea had been forming in his mind, risky but possible. "We marry." Bethany stared at him. "What?" "Think about it. Right now you are a single woman trying to prove up a claim. Vulnerable, easy to push around. But if we marry, I become part owner of this land. Whelan would have to go through both of us, and he knows I will not be intimidated the way he hoped you would be. It changes the calculus. That is a terrible reason to get married." "It is not the only reason." He took her hands, his expression serious. "Bethany, I care about you, more than I have cared about anyone in a very long time, maybe ever. I was going to wait, court you properly, give us more time. But time is something we might not have, so I'm asking now, will you marry me? Not just to save the farm, though that is part of it, but because I want to build a life with you. Because sleeping beside you is the best part of my day. Because I cannot imagine going back to the mountains without you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. This is the worst proposal in the history of proposals. "Is that a no?" "It is a yes, you impossible man. Yes, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, deep and thorough, pouring everything he felt into that moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and grinning like fools. "The preacher is still in town for another day," Thorn said. "We could do it tomorrow." "What about Whelan? He will know it is a deliberate move against him." "Good. Let him know. Let him see that we are not backing down." They rode back to San Elizario the next morning, wearing their best clothes and carrying wildflowers Bethany had picked at dawn. Mr. Santos agreed to stand as witness, along with the Mexican woman who ran the boarding house. The ceremony was simple, conducted in English and Spanish both, binding them together in the eyes of law and God. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thorn kissed Bethany with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. She melded into him, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to just the two of them. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," he said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue, but feeling right nonetheless. They filed the marriage certificate with the county clerk that same day, making sure the documentation was airtight. Now the farm belonged to both of them, and any attempt to force Bethany off the land would have to go through Thorn as well. News of the marriage spread through San Elizario like wildfire. When they stopped at the trading post to buy supplies, Santos clasped Thorn's hand firmly. "Well done," he said. "You have made an honorable woman honest and given Whelan something to think about at the same time. We will see if it is enough. It will be. Men like Whelan are used to intimidating the weak. But you are not weak, and now neither is she. Together, you are stronger than he expected." They returned home as the sun set, husband and wife, partners in every sense. That night they consummated their marriage with a tenderness and passion that left them both trembling. Afterward they lay tangled together, and Bethany traced the line of Thorn's jaw with her fingertips. "I never thought I would find this," she said softly. "Love, I mean. Real love. I thought I would spend my life alone, struggling to survive. You are not alone, and you never will be again, not as long as I draw breath. That is quite a promise. It is the only one that matters." They fell asleep to the sound of wind in the cottonwoods and the distant call of coyotes, and if either of them worried about what morning would bring, they did not speak of it. Whelan's response came 3 days later. Thorn was working on reinforcing the barn when he heard the sound of many horses approaching. He grabbed his rifle and ran toward the cabin, shouting for Bethany to get inside. This time there were at least a dozen riders, Whelan at their head. They formed a semicircle around the cabin, blocking any escape. Thorn positioned himself in the doorway, rifle ready, Bethany behind him with her own weapon. "I heard congratulations are in order," Whelan called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. "The mountain man and the farmer girl, married. How romantic." "State your business and get off my land," Thorn said flatly. "Your land. Well, that is the issue, is it not? You see, I have been doing some research. This claim was filed under Bethany Turner. Now she is Bethany Jameson. That is a different legal entity, which means the claim is technically invalid unless filed under the new name within 30 days of marriage." Thorn felt ice form in his gut. He had not thought of that legal nuance. "We will file an amendment," he said. "Oh, I am sure you will try. But I have been speaking with friends at the land office. They are very particular about paperwork. I would hate for there to be delays or complications that pushed you past your deadline for proving up the claim. You cannot do that. Married women transfer property all the time. Yes, but usually with proper documentation filed in advance. You two rushed into this marriage rather quickly, almost like you were trying to circumvent legitimate business interests. That kind of bad faith dealing does not sit well with government officials. This is harassment, Bethany said, stepping forward, pure and simple, and it is on record now. The marshal knows what you are doing. The marshal knows I am trying to acquire land for my business, which is perfectly legal. What happens to be unclear is whether you still have legal standing to refuse my offers. Whelan smiled, cold and satisfied. I will give you 1 week to produce proper documentation that this claim is valid under your married name. If you cannot, I will file for the land as abandoned. Good day, Mrs. Jameson. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following. Thorn stood watching them go, mind racing through options. Can he really do that? Bethany asked, her voice tight with panic. I do not know, but we cannot take the chance. We need to get to El Paso today and file the amended claim. Now. They hitched the wagon in record time and drove hard for El Paso, reaching the land office just before it closed for the day. The clerk was a thin, nervous man who listened to their request with visible discomfort. Amending a claim after marriage is standard procedure, he said, pulling out forms. But I have to warn you, there is normally a 2-week processing period for amendments. We need it done faster, Thorn said. This is urgent. I understand, but the regulations are clear. I have to send the paperwork to the territorial office in Austin for verification. That takes time. How much time? 3 weeks, typically. We do not have 3 weeks. Can it be expedited? For an additional fee and with proper justification, possibly, but I cannot guarantee anything. Thorn pulled money from his pocket, more than the fee should have cost. Consider it expedited. The clerk took the money and the paperwork, promising to mark it urgent. But as they left the office, Thorn felt no confidence that it would be enough. They spent a miserable week waiting, tending the crops and watching the road for either Whelan's men or word from the land office. The corn was now taller than Bethany, the ears forming and filling out. Another 3 weeks and they would have a successful harvest that would prove the claim beyond any doubt. But 3 weeks might as well be 3 years if Whelan's legal maneuvering succeeded. It was Marshal Hawkins who brought news, riding out to the farm on a sweltering afternoon. Thorn and Bethany met him in the yard, hope and dread warring in their expressions. The territorial office in Austin has approved your amendment, Hawkins said without preamble. Your claim is legally valid under your married name. Whelan cannot contest it on those grounds. Bethany nearly collapsed with relief. Thorn caught her, holding her steady while his own knees felt weak. Thank you, Thorn managed. Thank you for bringing us the news. Thank whoever it was in Austin that pushed the paperwork through. These things usually take months. Hawkins shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. I also wanted to warn you. Whelan is furious. Word is he feels you made him look foolish, getting married and fixing the legal issue before he could exploit it. Angry men do stupid things. We will be careful. More than careful. I cannot be out here all the time to keep watch. If he comes at you with violence, you have the right to defend yourselves. But make sure it is actually self-defense. Do not give him an excuse to claim you were the aggressors. After the marshal left, Thorn and Bethany stood in their field, surrounded by growing crops and hard-won security. The sun beat down relentlessly, and sweat plastered their clothes to their backs, but they had never felt more triumphant. We did it, Bethany said, wonder in her voice. We actually did it. The land is ours. It was always yours. We just had to prove it to men who did not want to see. She turned in his arms, her green eyes bright with emotion. Thank you for fighting for this with me, for believing it was worth fighting for. You are worth fighting for. Everything else is just land. It is not just land. It is our future, our home. Yes, he agreed, looking around at the results of their labor. It is. The next weeks passed in relative peace. With the legal issue resolved and the marshal watching more closely, Whelan seemed to have backed off. The crops matured under watchful eyes, the corn silk turning brown, and the bean pods swelling with seeds. By early August, they were ready for harvest. The work was exhausting, cutting corn stalks and stripping ears, picking beans until their backs ached and their fingers were stained green. But it was joyful exhaustion, the satisfaction of seeing hard work literally bear fruit. They harvested bushels of corn and beans both, far more than they could eat themselves. Santos agreed to buy the surplus at fair prices, and other farmers began stopping by to ask advice about irrigation and soil preparation. Bethany's success was giving other small farmers hope that they could resist the big ranchers' pressure. It was mid-August when the final confrontation came. Thorn was in the barn, repairing a harness, when he heard shouting from the cabin. He grabbed his rifle and ran out to find 3 of Whelan's men surrounding Bethany in the yard. She had her rifle trained on them, but they had spread out, making it impossible to cover all of them at once. "Problem here?" Thorn said, his voice dangerously quiet as he approached. The lead man, a scarred brute named Pike, sneered at him. "No problem. We are just delivering a message from Mr. Whelan. He wanted you to know that accidents happen to people who do not know when they are beaten." "That sounds like a threat." "Just a friendly warning." "Warning received. Now get off our land." Pike's hand drifted toward his pistol. "You got a lot of bark for someone who is outnumbered. 3 against 2 is not my idea of outnumbered, and I promise you, if shooting starts, you will be the first one to die." They stared at each other for a long, tense moment. Then, hoofbeats sounded from the road. Marshal Hawkins rode into the yard, along with 2 deputies, and surprisingly, old Mr. Santos. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Hawkins said mildly. "Awful far from Whelan's ranch to be paying social calls." "We were just leaving," Pike muttered. "Good idea. And tell Whelan I will be having a conversation with him soon. The territorial governor sent word that he is taking an interest in land disputes in this area. Seems someone filed a detailed complaint about intimidation and harassment. Funny thing about governors, they do not like ranchers who make the territory look lawless to investors back east." Pike and his companions rode off, and Hawkins tipped his hat to Thorn and Bethany. "Your friend in Denver came through," he explained. "Kicked the complaint all the way up to the governor's office. Whelan is about to have federal attention on his operations, which means he needs to be on his best behavior for a while. I doubt he will bother you again." After they left, Thorn pulled Bethany close, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. "It is over," he said. "Really over this time. I cannot believe it. I keep waiting for something else to go wrong." "Nothing is going to go wrong. We won. The land is ours, the harvest is good, and Whelan has been leashed. We actually won." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "We did it. We really did it." "You did it? I just helped." "No. We did it together. That is what makes it matter." They stood in their yard, surrounded by evidence of their success, and let themselves finally believe that the fight was over. The rest of August passed in blissful peace. They sold their surplus crops and had enough money to buy proper equipment for the next season. Thorn built a chicken coop and bought laying hens, adding fresh eggs to their diet. Bethany planted a kitchen garden with vegetables and herbs, making the cabin area into something that felt like a real home. As September arrived and the weather cooled slightly, they began to plan for the future. Thorn wanted to expand the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and maybe a loft. Bethany wanted to acquire a milk cow so they could make butter and cheese. Together they sketched plans and dreams in the evenings, their future spreading out before them with wonderful clarity. It was late September when Bethany realized she had missed her monthly bleeding. At first she dismissed it as stress, but when October arrived with the same absence, she allowed herself to hope. She told Thorn on a cool October evening as they sat outside watching the stars. He had been reading aloud from Emerson, his deep voice giving the transcendentalist philosophy an almost biblical gravity. When he paused between passages, she said, "I think I might be pregnant." The book dropped from his hands. He turned to stare at her, his expression stunned. "Truly?" "I am fairly certain. I have been tired and queasy in the mornings, and I have missed 2 months." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his rough features into something almost boyish. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy about it? I know we have not discussed children yet." "Happy?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Bethany, I'm more than happy. I'm terrified and thrilled and amazed all at once. We made a child. A whole new person. I am scared, she admitted. Childbirth is dangerous, and I do not know if I will be a good mother. You will be wonderful, and I will be here every step of the way. We will figure this out together, just like we have figured out everything else. She relaxed into his embrace, letting his confidence steady her own fears. They sat together under the vast Texas sky, contemplating the miracle of new life. The pregnancy progressed well through the winter months. Bethany tired easily and suffered bouts of sickness, but overall she remained healthy. Thorn fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and work less. They spent the winter months preparing, building a cradle from smooth pine and sewing small clothes from soft fabric. Whelan left them alone, his attention diverted by the federal investigation into his business practices. Rumors spread that he was being forced to sell off some of his holdings to satisfy tax debts. Justice, when it finally arrived, had come from an unexpected direction. Spring came again to the Texas frontier, their second spring on the farm. Bethany was hugely pregnant now, moving carefully and tiring quickly, but she insisted on helping with the spring planting, working alongside Thorn to get seeds in the ground for another season. It was a warm May afternoon when her labor started. Thorn rode frantically to San Elizario to fetch the midwife, a capable Mexican woman named Señora Gutierrez, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. She arrived calm and efficient, taking charge of the situation with practiced ease. Thorn was banished to the yard while Señora Gutierrez worked. He paced like a caged animal, every cry from the cabin making him want to break down the door and help somehow. But this was one thing he could not fix with strength or determination. He could only wait. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. As the sun rose on a new day, a baby's cry split the air. Thorn was moving before he consciously decided to, bursting through the cabin door to find Bethany propped up on pillows, exhausted and sweaty and radiant, holding a tiny wrapped bundle. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice hoarse but happy. Thorn approached slowly, afraid he might break something with his rough hands. But when Señora Gutierrez placed the baby in his arms, he held the infant with surprising gentleness. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be green like his mother's. "He is perfect," Thorn breathed. "Absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Bethany asked. Thorn thought of his mother, who had fought so hard to give her children a better life. "William, after my father, if that's all right with you." "William Jameson. I like it." They spent the rest of the day marveling at their son, taking turns holding him and counting his tiny fingers and toes. Señora Gutierrez stayed for 3 days, making sure both mother and baby were thriving before declaring them healthy and heading back to town. The next months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. William grew rapidly, his cries filling the cabin with life. Thorn discovered a patience in himself he had not known existed, spending hours rocking his son or singing old mountain ballads in his rough voice. Bethany recovered her strength quickly, aided by Thorn's insistence that she rest while he handled the heavy work. Together, they balanced childcare and farm work, falling into new rhythms as a family of 3. By the time William was 6 months old and starting to sit up on his own, the farm was more prosperous than ever. They had expanded their fields and were growing enough surplus to sell regularly to markets in El Paso. Other small farmers had followed their example, forming a loose cooperative to share equipment and knowledge. The big ranchers were learning that they could no longer simply push aside the homesteaders. Santos visited one autumn afternoon, bringing gifts for William and news from town. "Whelan is selling out," he said. "The federal investigation found too many irregularities in his land titles. He's being forced to liquidate most of his holdings. The ranch will be broken up and sold to smaller operators." "Good," Thorn said with satisfaction. "Maybe now people can farm in peace." "That is largely thanks to you two. You showed that it was possible to stand up to him and win. Others took courage from that." After Santos left, Bethany leaned against Thorn as they watched William play with wooden blocks on the floor. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The mountains? The solitude?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not enough to trade what I have here. This is where I am meant to be, with you and William, building something lasting. We could visit the mountains someday, show William where his father used to live. I would like that. Summer in the high country, all three of us together. But this is home now. This farm, this life. You. She turned in his arms to kiss him, long and deep and full of promise. When they broke apart, William had crawled over and was tugging on Thorn's pants leg, demanding attention with baby babble. Thorn scooped him up, tossing him gently in the air until he squealed with laughter. Bethany watched them, her heart so full it ached. This was what they had fought for. Not just land or crops or legal rights, but this moment, this family, this life they had built together from nothing but stubborn determination and growing love. The years rolled on, marked by harvests and birthdays and small triumphs. When William was 3, Bethany gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Sarah, who inherited their mother's red hair and their father's steady temperament. The cabin grew to accommodate them, expanding outward and upward until it was a proper house with multiple bedrooms and a wide porch. Thorn never did return to mountain trapping full-time, though he would take William on hunting trips into the high country each fall, teaching him to track and shoot and respect the wilderness. Those trips became sacred time for father and son, a connection to Thorn's past and William's heritage. Bethany became known throughout the territory as a successful farmer in her own right, consulted by other women and men both on techniques for irrigating difficult land. She taught her daughters to read and write and run a farm, determined that they would never be helpless or dependent. Marcus Whelan died in 1885 in a gambling house in St. Louis, his fortune gone and his name forgotten by most. When Thorn heard the news, he felt no triumph, only a distant sadness for a life wasted on bitterness and greed. The farm prospered beyond their wildest dreams. By 1890, they owned not just the original quarter section, but adjoining land they had purchased as it became available. They employed seasonal workers during harvest and had become one of the more successful operations in the region. But success was measured in more than acreage and bushels. It was measured in the laughter of children playing in the yard, in the comfortable silence of husband and wife sitting together on the porch after a long day, in the knowledge that they had built something lasting, something that would endure beyond their own lives. On a warm evening in 1895, as the sun set in glory over the western mountains, Thorn and Bethany sat on that porch watching their children play. William was 17 now, tall and strong like his father, already courting a girl from town. The twins were 12, wild and bright and full of dreams. "Do you remember the day we met?" Bethany asked, her hand in Thorn's. "You were collapsed beside that plow, too stubborn to quit even when your body was giving out. And you stopped to help for no reason other than it was the right thing to do. Best decision I ever made." She leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable in the way only decades of partnership could create. "Thank you for stopping that day, for seeing me when others looked away. Thank you for letting me stay, for giving me a reason to come down from the mountains." They sat in silence as the stars began to appear, watching their children and the life they had created. Thorn thought back to that lonely man he had been, wandering the high country with no ties and no purpose beyond survival. He could barely recognize that person now. "I love you," he said, words that came easily now after years of practice. "I love you too," Bethany replied, squeezing his hand, "always." The children's laughter rang out across the yard, carrying on the evening breeze. In the fields, crops rustled in the wind, ready for the coming harvest. And in the distance, the mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky, beautiful and wild and free. This was their legacy, not wealth or fame, but love that endured and family that thrived. A farm built from impossible ground, watered with sweat and tears and stubborn hope. A marriage forged in adversity and strengthened by shared purpose. When Thorn finally died in 1920 at the age of 66, it was in the bed he had shared with Bethany for over 4 decades, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. His last words were of love and gratitude, and his last sight was Bethany's face, still beautiful to him despite the silver in her hair and the lines time had carved. Bethany lived on for another 8 years, tending the farm with help from their descendants, and keeping Thorn's memory alive through stories told to wide-eyed grandchildren. She spoke of the mountain man who had stopped to help a struggling woman plow hard ground, and how that single act of kindness had changed both their lives forever. When she finally joined Thorn in 1928, at the remarkable age of 70, she was buried beside him in the small cemetery outside San Elizario. Their shared headstone bore a simple inscription: "Together they broke hard ground and made it bloom." The farm passed to William, who worked it with the same dedication his parents had shown. The twins married and moved on to their own adventures, but they returned often with their families, keeping the connection strong. And in the evenings, as the sun set over Texas, William would sit on the porch his father had built and tell his own children about their grandparents, about a mountain man who came down from the high country and found love in an unlikely place, about a young woman who refused to give up her father's dream, no matter how impossible it seemed, about two people who took hard ground and impossible odds and made something beautiful anyway. The story lived on long after they did, passed down through generations as a reminder that sometimes the strongest love grows from the hardest soil. That kindness offered freely can change the course of lives, that two people working together can accomplish what seems impossible alone. And in the mountains to the west, the peaks still stood eternal, watching over the land that Thorn and Bethany had claimed. The wind still whispered through the cottonwoods by the stream. The earth still turned, season after season, bringing new growth from old ground. Their love had become part of the land itself, as enduring as stone and as necessary as water. It lived in every crop that grew, every child that was born, every sunset that painted the sky with glory. It lived in the simple truth that had guided them from the beginning, that seeing someone struggle and choosing to help, that taking hard ground and working it together, that refusing to give up even when the world says you should, these things matter. They make all the difference. And so the story ends where all good stories should. With love that lasts, with family that endures, with hard work rewarded and dreams fulfilled. Two souls who found each other in the vast wilderness of the American frontier, who chose each other against all odds, who built a life that mattered. The mountain man and the farmer's daughter, Thorn and Bethany. Together they broke the hard ground, and together they made it bloom. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.